Hello again, everybody. Welcome back to Adirondack Adventures. Once again, my name is Josh. Summer's rolling along. Canoe camping and paddling are the activities du jour. And for those of us that paddle in the Adirondack Canoe Classic or 90 miler, this is the time of year, at least for me, that I start to really seriously prepare physically for that event. Mental preparation for the 90 miler never stops though. I feel like every single day I'm thinking about my accommodations, my gear, my portage strategy, my caloric intake, and that's what this video is. Maybe to provide a little bit of tips and tricks for not only newbies and first timers, but for veterans alike. So the intention of this video is to kind of highlight my thinking process, all the different details I try to iron out in order to have a successful 90 miler. So first and foremost, let's talk about what the 90 miler actually is. The 90 miler or Adirondack Canoe Classic is a more than 4-decade-old Adirondack tradition that is a 3-day canoe race starting in Old Forge, New York and continuing on through to Saranac Lake, New York. The race course itself basically follows the first 90 miles of what's known as the Northern Forest Canoe Trail. And the Northern Forest Canoe Trail begins in Old Forge, New York and extends all the way to Maine. It's 740 miles. And for the most part, the race organizers have followed the first 90 miles. They have altered the path slightly to protect some ecologically sensitive areas and to make the drop off and pickup a lot easier for the 300 boats that participate. But for the most part, it's that first 90 miles of the NFCT. The logistics of doing the 90 miler is different for each and every one of us, but there's some common themes. We need to know where we're staying. This is a 3-day event, and not only that, the start and finish moves each day. So staying at one place sometimes can become logistically difficult. Even if you're from the area, you have specific details that need to be ironed out. You can live in Old Forge, but by the time the race gets to day 3, going back and forth to your home each and every night may not be the smartest thing and may eat up a lot of time. So even if you're from the area, you have to figure out specific details. And not only that, we all have pit crews and they're coming from different locations. So keeping our pit crew safe and happy and busy when they're not servicing us are all these aspects that we have to consider each and every time we do the 90 miler. My first time doing the 90 miler was in 2022, and I went as an open touring, non-competitive paddler. This is the Wave 1 paddlers. They're made up of all the different age groups, all the different boat classes. These aren't racers that are racing in the traditional sense where they're competing against each other. They're more or less competing against themselves, and they're trying to beat the cutoffs each and every day and just complete the 90 miler. I'll tell you, that's the state of mind I was in going into my first 90 miler, and I'm glad I was, because I barely finished my first 90 miler. My second 90 miler was in 2023. I was feeling fit, and at a very last minute basis, I was gonna go as an open touring paddler, but I switched into the solo recreation class, and I unexpectedly won my age group and came in first place. There is a major difference between the open touring paddling and the racing paddling, and I hope to highlight a little bit of the differences between those two categories. Although what I say is going to be very specific to the solo rec category, because I've never raced in any other boat class, and as soon as you switch boat classes, the 90 miler becomes a whole different thing. You could have done it 10, 12 times in one boat category, and just switching from solo rec to a one-man guide boat, for example, would be a completely different race. The weight of those boats and how you portage the boats, it's a whole different strategy that has to be worked out depending upon what boat class you go with. Let's get into the actual race course itself. The racers leave in waves. Wave 1 would be the non-competitive group. They leave the earliest. They have the longest time to get through the race course. And then each boat class is released in 5 to 10 minute increments from Old Forge. You leave Old Forge, you paddle the Fulton chain of lakes, which are 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, and 5th lake. Once you get through 5th lake, you reach the town of Inlet. This is where your first portage of the day is. It's about 0.3 miles. It's well-maintained trail and road the entire way. You have access to your pit crew for the first time here in Inlet. There's also a pit stop where there's water available. If you re-enter the water in 6th Lake, you paddle through 6th Lake into 7th Lake until you reach your second portage of the day. It is the 8th Lake Campground Portage. It's approximately 1 mile in length, and it's flat road the entire length from A to B. There are bathroom facilities located in 8th Lake. They're the only bathroom facilities on day 1, so if you prefer to use a bathroom, this is your place for you. You re-enter the water in 8th Lake. After a short paddle, you reach the 3rd portage of the day. It's through Brown's Track. It's 1.25 miles, and it is undulating, well-maintained trail the entire length. The last 500 feet of Brown's Track Portage is on a wooden boardwalk where you re-enter the water in what's known as Brown's Track Stream. It's very tortuous, windy, narrow. Once you pass through that section, you will negotiate a beaver dam as you enter Racket Lake. Racket Lake can get nasty. It can get choppy, it can get windy if the weather isn't cooperating. You paddle across Racket Lake into the mouth of the Marion, where you proceed to have a 4-mile upstream paddle on the Marion River. There's sometimes some beaver activity in that section also. Then you reach your 4th and final portage of day 1. It's on private land. It's only about 1,500 feet. You enter the Eckford chain of lakes then. You paddle Etawana Lake, Eagle Lake, and into Blue Mountain Lake, where day 1 concludes for the day on the southwestern shore of Blue Mountain Lake. The entire length of day 1 is 35 miles, and it contains over 3.5 miles of portaging your canoe overland. Day 2 begins about 2.5 miles south of the Long Lake Bridge at a place called Bissell Field. And paddlers paddle the entire extent of Long Lake north. You then enter the mouth of the Racket River, and you'll be paddling downstream on the Racket River. You will reach the cutoff for Cold River that'll enter on your right-hand side. You jog left there. You paddle several more miles until about mile 19, where you reach the portage, the only portage on day 2. It's 1.25 miles on very rugged trail up and over Racket Falls. You re-enter below Racket Falls. You will paddle for several more miles. You will pass the cutoff for Stony Creek Ponds. You will pass Axton Landing. You will eventually pass Trombley Landing. And day 2 concludes about 5 miles northeast of Tupper Lake on Route 30 at a takeout called the Crusher. Day 2 is 30 miles in length, and it has one portage of 1.25 miles. Day 3 begins at Fish Creek Campground in front of Site 230. You paddle out of Fish Creek Campground. You paddle south on Upper Saranac Lake. You get to your first carry about 1.5 to 2 hours into your paddling. It's called Bartlett Carry, and Bartlett Carry is one of the most magical points on the 90-miler race course. There's a full-time bagpipe player in there. It's very inspirational. You get to look a lot of the Adirondack paddling community directly in the eyes. You have access to your pit crew also there if you like. You re-enter the water after exiting Bartlett Carry in Middle Saranac Lake. After a short jaunt across Middle Saranac Lake, you'll enter a narrow, confined portion. The Saranac River becomes clear at that point. You paddle a windy portion of the Saranac River until you get to the second portage of the day. It's the upper lock carry. It's only about 175 feet around the upper lock. Really quick and dirty. You re-enter the river. You'll paddle for several miles through Lower Saranac Lake till you reach the third and final portage of the day. It's called the lower lock carry. It's about 500 or 600 feet up and over a hill. The hardest part of the lower lock carry is re-entering your boat in Osita Lake. There's about a 2 to 2.5 foot drop from the dock to the water level. You'll have to kind of just make a leap of faith into your boat. You'll paddle through Osita Lake into Lake Flower, and that last 1,500 feet or so from the flagpole to the park, everybody is given their all. They're trying to shave as many seconds off, and you are coming into one of the most welcoming paddling communities that exists. Awesome vending. Your friends, family, and pit crew are there waiting for you, and you have just completed a 90-miler. It's a special thing. It's not possible without all the minor details and logistics that are unrelated to the race itself. They kind of get you to the race and take care of you during the race. So accommodations, transportation to and from the start and finish. How is your boat transported? What are you eating? How are you recovering? Your pit crew. Have you thought of your pit crew? Are they doing things that are fun when they're not servicing you? Is this a great event for them also? Because they're part of this also. So all of these details have to be considered, and let's go through how I think about my 90-miler. All right, so let's just briefly discuss the logistics of doing a 90-miler. And what I mean by logistics, I mean the peripheral logistics. I don't mean actually competing in the 90-miler. That's a whole separate thing. We'll get to that. But I'm talking about all the details that need to be figured out in order to have a successful 90-miler. When I found out about the 90-miler and started doing my preliminary prep work to get ready for the 90-miler, I had no idea what I was getting myself into. As I start to dig deeper, I start to be going, oh my God, where am I going to stay? Who's going to move my car? How does my car get to and from places? Are there people that do this for you? Well, I had no idea. I had no idea even about a pit crew at the time. And just discovering all those things, I'm going, who the heck is going to be my pit crew? So the logistics behind the 90-miler are different for each and every one of us. You may live locally. I'm coming from out of town, but you may live locally. You may live in Old Forge, and where you are staying that first night for the opening day is so convenient. You have a great night's sleep, and you show up in Old Forge, and it takes you 5 minutes to set up your boat, and off you go. Well, you just ended in Blue Mountain Lake. You're driving back to Old Forge, okay? Go back to Old Forge. So the next day you got to be in Long Lake. And that ends at the Crusher. Are you going back to Old Forge then? You can see that even for locals, there's a logistical thing. Moving your car up and down the chain of lakes is an issue. Where's your pit crew coming from? Do you have places to stay along the chain of lakes? Are you getting accommodations too? Because they're sometimes rare and hard to find, especially for that weekend. So the logistics behind it all. What are you eating? How are you recovering? What is your pit crew up to when they're not servicing you? Have you thought about these things? Because it's about more than just you. It's about your pit crew too. And I'm grateful that my pit crew, my wife and kids, love it just as much as me. And part of it is because the pit crew community is awesome. They have their own experience with all the people out there servicing all the different paddlers, and there's a lot of camaraderie with the pit crews. So my family loves to do it, and I'm lucky to even have this. I was considering doing my first 90-miler with absolutely no pit crew at all, and I came to my senses because it would have been virtually impossible to do the 90-miler without a pit crew. So tip, take good care of your pit crew, okay? Make it special for them also. So let's move on to some of the things that you have to think about for the actual race, okay? So some of the strategies that I employ, this is my third time going through the 90-miler, so I've learned little tricks. There's things that work for me. Let's talk about hydration and caloric intake, because I just said that the logistics are very paddler specific, but so is hydration and caloric intake. And really that's a common thread through it all, is that this is very specific to boat class, to how experienced you are, how fit you are. Some of us can go on less calories, some of us can go on less water, some of us can go on less rest. So know your body, be prepared for the race course itself, and hydrate well. That's the other common thing, is that hydration is important to all the paddlers. It's just the amount and how you're doing it varies. So for me, I'll tell you a little bit about my strategy. Is I'm solo rec. So I carry a 2-liter water bladder and a camelback, and it rests on the floor of my boat between my legs as I'm paddling. Right? I have a hose that's connected to my mouth. I like watered down Gatorades or IV water. The liquid IV water packets, I've been using those as well, but watered down Gatorades, flavors that I like, I water them down to about 60%, and I find that that is the best thing. I just want to consume lots of fluids, and that's what gets me to drink a lot, is a watered down Gatorade. The full flavor Gatorade is too strong, and plain water is too boring, so I do something in the middle. The other tip is that when I get to inlet, I have my pit crew there with a cooler and a whole new fresh bladder with an entirely different flavor, right? So I switch out my bladder entirely in inlet. I put in a new bladder that's ice cold. It has a completely different taste than what I've been sucking on for the last 2 hours. And what I find is having that new flavor is just something new, and your body's like, hey, give me more of that. And I consume more fluids if I do it that way. So that's my tip, is switch it out in inlet. I find inlet is a great place to meet with my pit crew. It's one of my most strategic points in the race. So in inlet also, I not only change out my water bladder, but because I have a camelback, it allows me to carry my water very easily as I portage through inlet. So that's another aspect of this, is the camelback as a hydration device, or a method. And there's all different methods for hydration, and I'll tell you, different boat classes will hydrate differently. Some use a microcell foam that's glued to the bottom of the boat, and a jug that kind of is inserted into that with a hose that comes up from the bottom of the boat, and they change those out throughout the race. And that's one thing I will say when it comes to hydration, is that be familiar with different boat classes and how they hydrate. Like I said, I use a camelback for solo rec because it works well with this boat and how it's portaged, and not only paddled but portaged. So make sure your hydration makes sense for how you're going to portage. And since I'm talking about portaging, let's go into that topic, because portaging your canoe is part art and part science. I know that is a cliche that's overused all the time, but in the 90 miler it really has meaning. As a canoe tripper, we're all familiar with portaging our canoe. It's about getting from A to B. And that portage trail is however rugged, and it's maybe miles long, and you know you have to get from A to B. And however long it takes you, you do it. It might take you half a day to get out to a specific pond in the Adirondacks, but you do it because you want to get out there. In the 90 miler, you don't have the luxury of taking half a day to portage. It's about efficiency, and getting over land as fast as possible is the key to the 90 miler. There's an old adage in the 90 miler that the 90 miler is won on the water and lost during the portages. And each and every time I do the 90 miler, it couldn't ring true more, because you could be the best paddler, you could be the most fit paddler, you could have a half a mile or a mile per hour advantage on the water over the field. You could be that good of a paddler and lose it all on one bad portage through inlet or through Brown's track. And I will say there are people who use the portages to make up time, and they use the portage, or they use that advantage on the overland portion of the race. You got to remember, this is an overland and on the water race. There's almost 5 miles of overland travel in the 90 miler. So people that go hard, people that trail run, people that just go hard for a mile or a mile and a quarter can make up that paddling advantage that somebody may have gained on the water. So you have to portage efficiently, you have to portage quickly, and also on top of it, it's rigorous. You don't want it to be energy depleting. So learn about how each boat class is portaged. I'll say solo wreck, typically this boat, a Placid Boatworks Shadow, a lot of people will one shoulder carry this boat on the 90 miler. For me, that is not what I do. I go against the grain. A one shoulder carry for a mile and a quarter, I'm fighting a boat for most of that portage. For me, I have to go overhead. If I go overhead, it allows me to move much more fast. I can actually jog, and it expends way less energy. So for me, I use a variation of bungee yoke. It's a quick and dirty version. It gets it done. I can move quickly. And yes, it takes me 30 seconds or 40 seconds after I get out of the water to attach my portage device, but I can move much faster with this boat overhead versus if it's on my shoulder and I'm constantly switching it and people are passing me. It's just very cumbersome, a one shoulder carry. People think that that's the fastest way, and it may be the fastest way for some people, but for me, it's definitely going overhead. Also learn about how the different boat classes portage differently. I had no idea about this. That was one of the biggest surprises about doing the 90 miler, is how each boat class has a generally accepted portage method. For example, what I'm talking about is if you're a C4, you're a 4-man canoe and you're racing, everybody is using wheels. Why are they using wheels? Because that's the fastest way to move a C4 across the land. And they have all their gear, the paddles and the hydration and their food, and for them it's easier to use it as a wagon and roll it and run with it on wheels than it is for them to go overhead. If you had asked me before I did my first 90 miler, how does a C4 portage? I would have said they all share time, they trade who carries on each portage, or I would have been completely wrong. So learn about how a 2-man guide boat portages. Learn how a K1, a 1-man kayak portages. Learn how a 2-man canoe portage, because I'd never seen that before. Upright, one guy, the stern has it on one shoulder, the bow man has it on the other shoulder, and it's crisscrossed, and they can run the trail with that portage strategy. I would have thought a 2-man canoe would just be yoke, carry, and some people do it that way also. And also 2-man canoe is sometimes carded. So there are these pivots, and people use different methods, and what I would say is be as comfortable as possible and know your portage strategy in and out. Make sure it's fail-safe, and if it does go wrong, you can quickly fix it. The last thing I will say about portaging your canoe, if you're racing your canoe and you use wheels on day 1, you need to use wheels for all 3 days. So on day 2, wheels can be very difficult. I will say you can't attach them until you reach the very crest of the hill coming out of the water, which is quite a climb. So be prepared to carry your boat up there anyways. And wheels on day 2, make sure that they are definitely the way you want to portage your boat for day 2. All right, so let's quickly go through the gear that you need to do the 90 miler and have a successful 90 miler. Again, this is very specific to me. What boat class are you paddling? Make sure you understand the boat class and how your experience is related to your boat class. As I mentioned, solo wreck, it's a light boat. It's easy to portage. It's efficient on the water. You can move 6 miles an hour. It's like driving a sports car through the Saranac Lakes. Compared to a 2-man guide boat or a Voyager or a stand-up paddleboard, there's people who do stand-up paddleboard through the 90 miler. I'll tell you, their experience is much different than mine. So understand what it's going to take using the boat you select. The next thing obviously is your paddle. It's the only thing you're dipping in the water. It's how you convey yourself across the water. And my first time through the 90 miler was with a $100 paddle I got off of Amazon. It was made of horrible materials that were way too heavy. The paddle wasn't sized properly. It was not ergonomic. My hands paid the price, and your hands will pay the price unless you have calluses. The 90 miler you will pay a price with your hands doing the 90 miler. The paddle I used my first time through, I made thousands of extra paddle strokes, and I paid the price choosing to use a $100 paddle off Amazon. Some other things, obviously, you need a PFD. You need to have a PFD. Many people use the inflatable PFD, including me. I got mine off of Amazon. It was about 65 or 70 bucks. I'll link it in the bottom here. And some other ancillary gear, sunglasses, hat, cooling towels people use. Some people dip their hat in the water and cool themselves off with that. Make sure your clothes are appropriate. You're getting wet. You're going in and out of the water, so wear dry fit clothes, things that aren't going to stay wet for a long period of time. The weather in the Adirondacks in September is unpredictable. It could be ridiculously cold, it can rain a lot, it can be hot. Make sure that you have different types of clothes with you because the weather's going to shift throughout the weekend also. So having some pants to keep the flies off of you, long sleeve shirts, short sleeve shirts. The 90 miler is an extended day trip. It's an ultralight day trip. Make sure that you have the right clothing. The last piece of clothing that needs to be discussed is footwear. It needs to be able to get wet. It needs to have good traction. It needs to perform. You have 4 miles of portaging on trails, so make sure you choose your footwear appropriately. I wear a trail runner. I wear an old trail runner that has just enough tread to get by. I'm not afraid for them to get dirty. They can get wet, they dry really quick. You can maybe even have them for day 2 or day 3. I usually bring several pairs, so I have a dry pair for day 2. But wearing the appropriate footwear is definitely an important aspect of the 90 miler. Don't forget sunblock. Don't forget maybe protection from the flies. My first time through the 90 miler, the flies, as I was moving through the Eckford Chains of Lakes and up the Marion River, the flies were ridiculous. They were horrible. And what I learned is that swatting a fly during the 90 milers is basically useless. The second year, I was prepared for the flies, and I actually wore pants, like a lightweight pair of pants, and there were absolutely no flies the second year. So that's the Adirondacks for you, but my point is be prepared for the unexpected because you're gonna get it. Okay, so just to recap, let's go over my tips and tricks for a successful 90 miler. And as I mentioned earlier, if it's your first time or you're feeling unfit, take a look at the open touring non-competitive group. I did that my first time through. I went with the open tours. It was one of the most memorable experiences ever, and I was going to go as an open tour my second time, but what had happened is I started to feel fit as I prepared for my second 90 miler, and I switched to the racing category. But if I was not feeling fit in year 2, I definitely would have stayed in the open touring group. So that's what I would suggest. If you're not sure about your ability in the 90 miler, go open touring. It gives you the longest day before you reach the cutoffs. You're the first wave to leave. So this gives you the biggest advantage to be successful in your first attempt. Number 2, iron out your accommodations. Where are you staying? This is specific to each and every one of us. Locals, people from out of town, you need a place to stay. This is a 3-day race that the start and finish moves each and every day. So having comfortable accommodations that are located in a place that you can get to and from the start and finish conveniently. And some people camp and they do this race. Some people stay at a very nice hotel. Some people do an Airbnb. There's many different ways. You can stay with a friend. in Old Forge, to stay with a friend in Long Lake and stay with a friend in Saranac Lake, and you have your logistics taken care of. But make sure that you figure out exactly how your car is going to get up and down the chain of lakes, where you're going to stay. Number 3, get mentally prepared for the race course itself. Look at maps, look at videos. I have several videos I've put up. If you haven't seen any of those, I'll put a couple of these on the top. But there's a lot of 90-miler content out there. It's maybe some of the best prep you can do. You can prepare yourself for what different sections of the race course look like. Know that the 90-miler is specific to specific boat classes. So make sure that you understand the type of boat you're paddling and the experience you're going to have as a result. Number 4, have a well thought out hydration strategy and caloric intake strategy, not only during the race, but for after the race, to prepare for the next day, to recover from the energy depletion that your body is going to go through. Get ready to eat calories and consume them in a way that your body is going to be responsive to, and bring foods that you're going to want to eat when you're going hard, because you may want a roast beef sandwich at 2 o'clock in the afternoon when you're at work, but eating a roast beef sandwich during the 90-miler and then digesting that over the next 17 miles of a race is not something that I would want to do. Portaging. You have to portage effectively. You have to portage quickly. You can't expend lots of energy when you're portaging, so make sure that you're doing it as best as you possibly can. Have a well thought out portage strategy and understand what the portage trails are and what the characteristics of the trails are, and try to move as fast as possible when you reach them. Lastly, carefully select the gear and your clothes and make sure that that's well thought out. If it looks like there's any hint of rain, bring some sort of rain gear. Have something for 35 miles in cold rain, because when you get out there and you got to go 6 or 7 or 8 hours in cold rain in a boat that's going to start to fill up with cold rainwater, you want to have the right clothes. The flip side of that is sometimes it's ridiculously hot, and you want to be prepared for that. Protect yourself from the sun, protect yourself from bugs. All those things have to be carefully considered in order to have a successful 90-miler. This is not exhaustive by any means, and this is very specific to my experience, I will mention once again. So do your own prep. Get lots of seat time in your boat. Understand how well your boat performs over long distances. Understand how well you're going to portage your boat and how you're going to portage your boat for distances. And try to prepare as much as you possibly can physically, because I can tell you the 90-miler is no joke, and it's going to be one of the most difficult things you've ever done. Other than that, guys, I really hope this video gave you something. If you like the content, please give me a thumbs up. Remember to like and subscribe videos as they come along, and stay tuned. There's a lot more coming.